His name was Wolf Messing. He was a man who could walk into the labyrinth of any human mind and return with its secrets. Thoughts, memories, hidden fears. None were safe from his perception. But there was one door he refused to open, a boundary he warned others never to cross. During one of his sessions, Messing encountered something so profound, so utterly terrifying, that he turned away from all experiments with the spirit world forever. He told his students that there are doors better left closed, that some knowledge is not meant for the living. What could a man who feared nothing in the mind of man have seen on the other side of life? What secret could be so overwhelming that it silenced a voice that could reveal anything? This case doesn't just suggest a world beyond our own. It presents the testimony of a man who looked through the keyhole and was terrified by the light he saw on the other side. This is not the story of a psychic. This is the investigation of a warning. To understand the weight of his warning, we must first understand the man. Wolf Messing was not a stage magician pulling rabbits from a hat. He was a phenomenon, studied by neurologists and psychologists across Europe. His abilities were not tricks. They were a verifiable, if inexplicable, faculty of his mind. He was subjected to rigorous tests. In one instance, documented by researchers, he was asked to locate a specific book in a vast library, known only to a committee chairman. Messing simply took the man's hand, walked through the aisles without hesitation, and pulled the correct volume from the shelf. He wasn't guessing. He was reading the map inside the chairman's mind. This was not mysticism. It was a form of radical perception. He experienced consciousness not as an isolated island inside the skull, but as a field of information that he could tune into. It was this precise, almost scientific understanding of mental phenomena that makes his later fear so compelling. He was not a man prone to fantasy. He was an explorer of consciousness who found a territory from which he had to retreat. He was our most reliable witness to the unknown, precisely because he treated it with such caution and dread. According to well-documented accounts, his demonstrations reached the highest echelons of intellectual society. He was reportedly invited to a private residence to be tested by two of the 20th century's greatest minds, Albert Einstein and Sigmund Freud. The mental command given by Freud was precise: retrieve a specific object from another room. Messing, without a word, did exactly as instructed, to the astonishment of both men. Messing himself tried to demystify the process, at least partially. He didn't claim to hear voices from the heavens. He called his experiments psychological tests and often explained his telepathy as an extreme sensitivity to the subtle, involuntary muscle movements a person makes when thinking, what science calls ideomotor responses. He argued that every focused thought creates a physical, readable signal, but this explanation only deepens the enigma. It frames him not as a mystic, but as a human measuring instrument of impossible sensitivity. He was living proof that consciousness is not contained within the skull, that our intentions are not private, that we are all constantly broadcasting our inner state into a shared medium. He did not see the world as a collection of separate individuals, but as a resonant chamber of minds. And it is from this grounded, almost clinical perspective that his warning about the afterlife must be judged. For a man who so vehemently warned against contacting the dead, Messing's life is filled with impossible contradictions, moments where the veil he so feared became undeniably thin. During a performance, a man in the audience asked about the fate of his parents. After a moment of intense silence, Messing replied, "Your mother is in this room, and your father fell in the war." A remarkable feat of insight, but the story did not end there. After the event, Messing sought out the man in the quiet of the hallway. He leaned in and whispered, "Your father asks for peace. He wants you to find his grave." Messing then named a small remote village the man had never even heard of. Days later, driven by a sliver of hope, the man traveled to that exact village. There he found his father's name, carved into the stone of a mass grave. This was not mind reading. The man himself did not possess this information. This was a direct transmission of knowledge from a consciousness that had, by all conventional measures, ceased to exist. This connection was not limited to strangers. After the death of his beloved wife, Messing continued to speak of her as if she was still present, just beyond his physical sight. He didn't treat her death as an ending, but as a relocation. He spoke of her as if she had simply moved to another room in the great house of existence, a room he could not yet enter, but whose presence he could still feel. These moments of contact were not random intrusions. They followed a clear and consistent logic. that pointed to a radical model of reality. If the father's consciousness survived the death of his body and brain, where did it go? If Messing's wife was still present, where was she? For Messing, these experiences were evidence that consciousness is non-local. It is not produced by the brain, any more than a radio produces the music it plays. The brain is a receiver, a tuning mechanism. When the receiver is broken at death, the broadcast does not stop. This is not a new idea, but a rediscovery of a very old one. Over 1,700 years ago, the philosopher Plotinus described the universe as emanating from a single divine source he called the One. From this source emerges the divine mind, or nous, an all-encompassing intellect that contains the blueprint of all reality. In this Neoplatonic map of existence, every individual soul is a thought within this universal mind. We are never truly separate. Our individual consciousness is merely a focused point of attention within a single, infinite consciousness that permeates everything. When Messing received a message from a dead soldier, he was not contacting a ghost. According to this ancient model, he was simply tuning his own receiver to a frequency of thought that still existed, perfectly preserved, within the universal mind. If what Messing experienced is true, then the implications are staggering. It redefines the very nature of who we are. We are not fragile biological machines, destined for oblivion. We are immortal consciousness, having a temporary human experience. This single idea dismantles our greatest fear, the fear of annihilation. The loss of a loved one is transformed from a permanent erasure into a change of state, a transition from one mode of being to another. The pain of grief remains, but the finality of nothingness is replaced by the certainty of continuity. But this knowledge comes with a profound responsibility. Messing often called his gift a heavy burden, a forced labor camp from which he could never escape. Why? Because if our consciousness is not a fleeting spark, but a permanent record within a universal mind, then every thought, every action, every intention is eternally inscribed into the fabric of reality. Imagine living your life not as a story that will be forgotten, but as a verse being written into a cosmic poem that will never end. There are no private thoughts. There are no forgotten deeds. The universe that Messing perceived was a universe of absolute transparency, of perfect memory. How would we live differently if we knew with certainty that we are accountable not to a distant judge in the sky, but to the eternal memory of the cosmos itself? This universe of perfect memory is not just a philosophical abstraction. Another brilliant mind, a century before Messing, claimed to have mapped it in meticulous detail. Emanuel Swedenborg was one of Europe's leading scientists in the 1700s, a master of metallurgy, anatomy, and engineering. Then, in his 50s, his perception shifted. He claimed his spiritual eyes were opened, allowing him to experience the afterlife directly, not as a faith, but as a tangible, observable reality. Swedenborg's descriptions, written with the precision of a scientist, are chillingly aligned with the world Messing seemed to fear. He wrote that after death we do not become someone else. We become more of who we truly are. The book of life is opened, which is not a physical book, but our own inner nature, now laid bare. He stated that heaven and hell are not rewards or punishments, but states of consciousness that we choose freely. We gravitate towards those whose inner nature, whose loves and intentions resonate with our own. In the afterlife, according to Swedenborg, there are no masks, no pretenses. The soul is drawn by an immutable law of spiritual physics to the reality that perfectly matches its deepest desires. This provides a terrifying context for Messing's burden. If he could perceive the inner thoughts and intentions of the living, what did he perceive about the dead? Perhaps his burden wasn't just knowing their secrets, but knowing their trajectory. Knowing that the inner world we cultivate in this life is not a dress rehearsal. It is the very substance from which our eternity will be built. And this brings us back to the central question, the core of the enigma. Why the terror? If Messing understood that consciousness is eternal, if he knew his wife was simply in another room, why did he recoil from the spirit world? Why the stark warning to his students? If you cross this boundary, you will disappear forever, for there is no way back. This statement is the key. It suggests something far more complex than a simple, peaceful continuity. The word disappear implies a loss of self, a dissolution. When asked to describe what he encountered in his trance states, Messing's public transcripts are famously evasive. He would deflect, change the subject, or offer a simple, "It is too dangerous." The boundary he perceived was not just between life and death, it was a boundary of comprehension. This is where the witness falls silent. It's the moment in the testimony where the investigator realizes the true horror is not in what is being said, but in what is being held back. What did he glimpse that made him believe one could disappear forever? Was it a realm of consciousness so vast, so alien, that the human personality, the I we hold so dear, is simply extinguished upon contact, like a single drop of water falling into an infinite ocean? Messing's silence finds a modern echo in one of the most well-documented medical cases of our time. Dr. Eben Alexander was a Harvard-trained neurosurgeon. He believed, as a scientist, that near-death experiences were simply hallucinations of a dying brain, until his own brain died. A rare bacterial meningitis attacked his neocortex, the part of the brain responsible for all higher functions, for thought, for identity, for consciousness itself. For 7 days he was in a coma, with virtually zero brain activity. By his own medical doctrine, the man known as Eben Alexander should have been gone, but he wasn't. He described leaving his body and journeying into a hyper-real universe of unconditional love, a realm of pure consciousness. He was shown the intricate, beautiful machinery of the cosmos. He met a divine intelligence. But when he was asked after his recovery to describe the ultimate nature of the source at the core of that reality, the transcript of his interview notes a long, difficult pause. He replied that our language simply collapses when it tries to contain it. The knowledge is so profound, the reality so absolute, that it cannot be translated into human concepts without being diminished. He was shown, but he cannot fully speak it. Perhaps this is the same limit Messing encountered. The disappearance he feared was not annihilation, but a cognitive dissolution. The terror of encountering a reality so immense that the human ego, the story of Wolf Messing or Eben Alexander, is revealed to be a temporary, beautiful but ultimately illusory construct. The fear is not of dying, but of waking up from the dream of the self. Why is this knowledge, hinted at by Messing, mapped by Swedenborg and experienced by Alexander, so fiercely resisted? Because it presents a direct challenge to the foundational assumption of our modern world, the paradigm of materialism. Materialism is the belief that matter is the only reality, and that consciousness is a secondary, accidental byproduct of complex brain chemistry. It is a philosophy that has given us incredible technological power, but at a great cost. It tells us that we are biological robots on a meaningless rock, that our lives are a brief flicker of light between two eternal darknesses. It is a universe without intrinsic purpose, without inherent meaning. Within this paradigm, the experiences of Messing are not evidence, they are anecdotes. Swedenborg is not a cartographer. He is a madman. Dr. Alexander is not a witness. He is a patient suffering from a hallucination. Mainstream science attempts to dismiss these cases by explaining them away. NDEs are attributed to a lack of oxygen in the brain, but this fails to explain how Dr. Alexander could have a hyperlucid experience while his neocortex was completely offline. Telepathy, like Messing's, is dismissed as clever trickery. But this fails to explain the cases, like the soldier's grave, where the information could not have been obtained by any conventional means. The barrier is not a lack of evidence. The barrier is the worldview itself. This knowledge is ignored because accepting it means accepting that the map of reality we have been given is not just incomplete, it is fundamentally wrong. It means facing the terrifying and exhilarating possibility that we are far more powerful and far more eternal than we have been taught to believe. The refusal to even consider this evidence stems from a deep philosophical error. We have mistaken the tool for the truth. Science is a powerful method for measuring the physical world, but materialism is the dogma that the physical world is all that exists. It's like a man with only a ruler declaring that music and love are not real because they cannot be measured in inches. This is why Messing's ethical deceptions, his choice to lie to grieving mothers during the war, become so significant. He understood that some truths are more important than literal facts. He chose the truth of hope over the fact of death. He was operating from a different, higher-order paradigm. The Neoplatonist philosopher Proclus, a successor to Plotinus, argued that the human soul possesses different levels of knowing. There is the rational knowing of the scientist, which dissects and analyzes, but there is a higher intuitive knowing, a direct participation in the divine mind, or nous. This is the knowing of the sage, the mystic, the artist. The materialist paradigm only validates the first kind of knowing. It is deaf to the second. Therefore, it has no tools to process the data from Messing's world. It can only label it as impossible and discard it. The evidence is ignored because the dominant operating system of our culture lacks the software to even open the file. The barrier is not in the data, it is in our deeply ingrained and tragically limited definition of what is real. Now, at the end of our investigation, we can finally understand Wolf Messing's paradox. His fear was not of death, but of a reality so vast it could overwhelm our sense of self. His silence was not born of ignorance, but of reverence for a mystery too profound for words, and his final secret message, discovered in an unsent letter, becomes his ultimate revelation. He wrote, "Do not be afraid, we are not really here. In reality, we exist in the mind of God. That is why everyone who has died still lives on, but in other realities. And sooner or later, we will all meet again." This is the key that unlocks everything. The warning, the contradictions, the fear, it was all a prelude to this final liberating truth. We are thoughts in a divine, infinite consciousness. The universe is not a place we are in, it is a thought that we are. Now that you have seen this evidence, you cannot unsee it. The separate self is a temporary role, but the consciousness observing through your eyes right now is eternal. If this investigation resonates with the questions you've been asking, subscribe to continue the great exploration. This concludes our inquiry for now, a synthesis of documented evidence and timeless philosophical questions, grounded in the sources that guide our journey. What truth did you recognize today?